So this will be the third video in a row where I've discussed Syria and the end of its civil war. And in those last two videos, I looked at how the current situation was evolving. But in this video here, I'm going to look at what factions are still fighting and what is it that they're still fighting for at this point. So if we go back less than 2 weeks, the situation in Syria looks like this, with Assad's government in control of 2/3 of the country, the Kurds in the north there, some pockets of rebels, and a few pockets of ISIS across the country. Today, the country looks like this, and there is a much clearer divide between the two true remaining factions in Syria at the moment. The main divide now is between Kurdish forces in the northeast and then the rebel factions, all of them together controlling pretty much the rest of Syria. And it's very interesting because these two groups both rose up in somewhat similar circumstances but had very different goals when it came to fighting the Syrian government. The rebels wanted to overthrow Assad and replace his government, whereas the Kurds were fighting for their autonomy within their region. Now, the Kurds and the rebels have come to blows before. It was a very complicated civil war, but there was one specific faction within the rebels that pretty much exclusively operated against the Kurdish forces in Syria. That rebel faction is the Syrian National Army, the SNA, who, despite their name and sounding very Syrian, were essentially a proxy group created by Turkey, specifically with the intent of trying to weaken Kurdish forces within Syria. For those of you that don't know, and I can't go into it in depth here, but one thing to understand is that there is a long, violent history of distrust and hatred between Kurds and the Turkish government. And the main thing you need to know is that Erdogan, Turkey's president, one of his main goals when it comes to him interfering and influencing parties in Syria is to explicitly make sure that there isn't an independent or fully autonomous Kurdish region right on his doorstep. So because of that, the rebel SNA faction has essentially been fighting the Kurds non-stop since it was created. And it appears with Assad gone that group is now entirely focused on the Kurds, and that fighting there in the country's north and the northeast will only continue to escalate as Turkey realizes it doesn't have to worry about funding the enemies of Assad because, well, the rebels are in charge now. So that's probably the first area we'll see the most violence going ahead, and that is basically Turkey turning all of its attention to one primary goal it has in Syria now, and that is making sure that they can destabilize or possibly even destroy any hope of that predominantly Kurdish region maintaining its own autonomy within Syria. Now, the second point of conflict is that everyone's favorite actor in the Middle Eastern region, Israel, is currently invading Syria. Now, they say they are doing so purely to establish a buffer zone between themselves and the new Syrian state in case it is hostile. Now, that is one interpretation of the situation, but I think, honestly, I don't tend to give Israel a lot of credit when it comes to what their motives are, and I don't think you should with any player in the Middle East. I think on a much more basic and sensible level, what Israel is doing is trying to be on the best possible starting point when it comes to negotiating with this new Syrian state. I've got it up there. You can see the dark blue surrounded area is the Golan Heights, which is historically Syrian, but Israel has occupied since the 60s pretty much. And you can see how close their new region, which they've just stretched out, their new buffer zone, and how close that is to the Syrian capital of Damascus. Looking at this purely from a political standpoint, you can't forget, from the Israeli perspective looking at this, the government that will now be forming in Syria will be led by a man who was formerly allied with both ISIS and Al-Qaeda before moderating. So there's probably quite a bit of skepticism about him from the Israeli perspective. So I think Netanyahu is going to try and negotiate with this new Syrian government from a position of strength, and he needs to be as strong as possible for that play to work. Which honestly is probably a play that's going to work. If you're talking to a new government that is barely together at the moment, what Israel has in its hand is a chunk of Syrian territory that they can negotiate with to give back or not to give back. And the Israeli military is within 30 kilometers of Damascus, which would scare anyone taking over in Syria. Israel is going to be coming to the table with a chunk of Syria in its back pocket to negotiate with, and the potential threat of invading and knocking out the Syrian capital within weeks, if not days. So I think those are the places you need to look at. First off, how does Israel play this in terms of dealing with the new government? How does Syria, whatever government it will have, react to that Israeli incursion and its attempts to negotiate from there? And how does this new rebel-led government deal with the fact that one of its factions will permanently be at war, more or less, with the Kurds within their country? The Syrian civil war was an incredibly complicated, multifaceted, multifactional conflict that was very hard to wrap your head around and very hard to see an easy solution to it. And I get the sense that these rebels that are going to take over Syria are going to have just as hard of a time trying to hold things together in the aftermath.